Hello everyone, my name is Ben and welcome back to PASSTHEauxCORD, a channel where we're switching up the content and bringing you something new today. And in case you missed the announcement video yesterday, I'm going to quickly run through with you what we're doing in this series that will be on the channel for the foreseeable future. We are taking a look at the top 500 albums of all time list from Rolling Stone, a list that has been recently updated, mind you, and taking every single album on the list and kind of reviewing them in a almost journal entry like fashion. Not quite taking as scripted of an approach as I did with some of my longer form reviews, but just kind of quickly talking about it, some things I like, dislike about the album. Of course, giving it a rating, things you would expect with a regular album review, but also deciding if it deserves its place on the list, whether it's too low, too high, or deserves to be here at all. So I think we're gonna have a lot of fun on this series, and we'll be looking back on this probably a couple years from now when I've finally hit number one, and this will be the start of something great. But today's video, despite me already saying that these are going to be some quicker reviews, might be one of the longest ones in the series for reasons that we'll get into. And today's video is going to be on Arcade Fire's debut album, Funeral. Generally speaking, this Arcade Fire record is one of the most legendary in the indie rock scene. Of the last 2 decades, it's definitely up there in the top 10, I'd say, of most iconic in the indie rock scene of things, and has a very big place in the alternative scene as well. Despite me getting much more into the indie side of things as I started this channel up, looking into bands like The Strokes, I had heard this album prior to starting this all back up and doing the YouTube channel. As a fan of music, it's a pretty hard one to avoid. And in the past, on my many re-listens of this album, and despite the huge amounts of praise it gets from many publications, I have never once got it with this album. It's never really clicked with me. It's probably been about a year since I went back again and tried to see what it was that everyone else saw in this album, so I figured now is a really great time, obviously, for me to go back and experience this again, see if what I know about music now will kind of click with me there. And before I talk about my opinions on it, I am well aware that it's probably pretty important to take some brief notes here on the significance that this album holds. 2004 is a pretty early time to even put the label indie, or indie rock especially, onto an album. And in some ways, I wish I could go back to 2004 and just experience this how it was, fresh in the musical landscape at the time, because now there's a list 6 miles long of all the indie albums that have existed since. And even now it does feel relatively unique when looking at the landscape of popular music, and especially that indie rock list. There's of course drums, bass, and guitar as you would expect from any rock band, but really more what you have going on this album is an entire orchestra. Horns, harps, organs, violins, the occasional synthesizer, which is of course expected, I guess, are all over this thing, creating some very interesting and unique sound. The vocal stylings on this album were also something kind of indicative of the future and where this scene especially would go, not just in the fact that there's a male and female lead vocalist from track to track at different times, but also especially in Will Butler's vocal performance on here that's somewhat cloudy, lifted, semi-emotive, and for lack of a better word, kind of whiny at times. Style probably went on to influence, at least I would think, things like Car Seat Headrest and Vampire Weekend. I definitely see little bits and pieces of this vocal style all over the indie rock scene. And finally, just the feeling of this album in general seems to have influenced this particular genre quite a bit. The moodiness of it, the understated kind of side of it, where it's still taking a lot of rock elements, but staying very calm. And again, I'll use the word understated with the way that it delivers the music. It just feels very indie. And despite that long list of things that you can even go on from what I already said, this album influenced, and despite how unique it feels, even though those list of characteristics have been reused over and over again, I just cannot get into this album for the life of me. Every time I come back to this record, I have the same experience with it, and almost every time before I remember my previous experience, I think that I'm going to like it a lot because I see the magic in track number 1, Neighborhood 1 Tunnels. It's a somewhat exciting track to listen to with the adventurous and romantic narrative that it plays up of these two lovers running away together and living their life outside of society, and it also feels somewhat theatrical with the way it builds up the mood. It really feels like the start of something great. Neighborhood 2 Laika, following that track, also is a really good indication to me. It's a little bit darker sounding than the previous one, but still has the same mood and atmosphere to it, and also goes on to tell a pretty compelling story. Then you hit track 3 and it's all derailed for me. The whole bilingual thing that a lot of songs like to do, where they use either English and Spanish I see a lot, or English and French also gets used a lot and is used in this situation, really just rubs me the wrong way. Even though I can understand quite a bit of French and I do understand what's being said on this song, I feel like it just adds nothing to impose this artificial language barrier in the middle of a song. You've dramatically cut down the amount of people who can understand all of the lyrics without having to use a translator. Using a translator, in my opinion, kind of takes you out of the immersion of the album. I've of course listened to a lot of albums in Spanish by now. There are many that are very popular in the current contemporary landscape, even of just my area, and it kind of peeves me sometimes because I have to take myself out of the immersion to go ahead and look at that. So, like I said, that just doesn't ring to me as a good sign, and it just kind of stays derailed from that point outside of a couple highlights. This is one of a few things, including even just the overall mood of this album, that seems somewhat dramatic and pretentious. Another thing of note, and this is just a personal preference, there is nothing objective about this standpoint, but I really don't prefer longer songs. I've said this a lot of times on record before. I've also said a lot of times that when done right, it can be amazing. One of my favorite albums of all time, The Glowing Man by Swans, 8 tracks, 2 hours, do the math. But I feel like 5 minutes is just that really sweet spot for having crappy song. Because it's not quite long enough to do something huge and monumental, but it's not short enough to be snappy, instantaneous, and fun either. I guess I just feel like there's no reason to hold on to the listener longer than you need to. And of course, if you take a look, almost every song on the album is about 5 minutes, unfortunately. But despite my pet peeve, something that is unique to this album is the fact that it feels very bittersweet for the entire runtime, but at some point that bittersweetness just becomes plain old sickeningly sweet. I don't despise that feeling about it, but I really don't prefer how overly sentimental it feels. I really do love the writing in certain points. Tunnel, Power Out, In the Backseat especially is a great one, but on the other hand, it's very disjointed. I feel like the protagonist we're following just kind of gets cut off halfway and we don't really see where all of the stories are going, and they just start overlapping all over the place, and it's really hard to follow what is trying to be told to me on this album, unfortunately. Even when you say that, it feels like it's trying to glue itself together with these motifs. You've got constant mentions of shadows, snow, and sparks especially are some that I realize, and there's probably some that went over my head as well. So overall, it just doesn't feel cohesive lyrically whatsoever, even if I do really like the writing and some of the sentiments. This feels just one step away from being a really good concept album. I mean, you even have the trend of neighborhood number whatever all the way down to 4. I guess to really sum it all up, this album gives me the feeling that it's trying to be a lot more important than it is. And you can totally break this all down to this just not being my thing. And it clearly isn't. But even then, I feel like I have some semi-objective points somewhere in there that prove that this isn't the perfect 10 out of 10 that so many people seem to say it is. Moving on to the next section here, breaking down my favorites and least favorites is probably going to be more of an important section in some of the other ones that aren't quite as long and drawn out as this one. I kind of had to mention a lot of specific tracks in order to get certain points across, but normally I won't necessarily be mentioning a lot in the way of individual tracks until this point, and then elaborating on why I like or dislike them. We'll do that a little bit here, but I just wanted to put it there so that this doesn't seem redundant, I guess. But favorites on here for me are Neighborhoods 1 and 2, Tunnels, and Laika, as I already mentioned multiple times in the previous portions of the video. But one that I actually didn't mention is number 6, Crown of Love. I really appreciated this track. It's easily my favorite on the record. I just didn't have any specific meaning behind mentioning it, I guess, so it didn't get mentioned before this point, but I really like the mood behind this track because it just fits with the lyrics so well. The instrumental is absolutely beautiful. That's something that you can kind of say about most of the tracks on this album, but on here, this one just particularly took me in. I like the structure of this song, and the lyrics behind it really fit the melodrama, which was kind of something I was criticizing about the other ones. This song is about losing faith in love to some degree, and I feel like the way that this album presents itself just really lends itself to that meaning. I'll give another nod to the closer on here. I already mentioned that I really like the lyrics on here, and that's the main reason to like this track, I suppose, but the singing is really good, and it has a good instrumental as well. Honestly, a really good way to close out the album that does add a little bit of cohesion, and it actually adds some meaning behind the title of the album, Funeral, as well, as this seems to be about coping with death of a loved one. Least favorites on here, I feel like I've already discussed to some degree, even more than my favorite, but my dislike for Un Ami Sans Lumiere is pretty obvious at this point, and the same can be said to an even higher degree for Haiti. I really don't know what this track is doing here whatsoever. It seems incredibly out of place, even on an album where most things feel out of place. The lyrics just feel like they don't begin to fit. And Wake Up is the one that is easily in my least favorites that I haven't mentioned before this point, as it just bores me to death. I can't really comment any further on it, as this one usually just results in me spacing out and not paying attention to the song because I find absolutely nothing captivating about it. So in conclusion, I want to wrap this back around to kind of say once again, I don't think this suits my tastes very well, but I don't think that this is anywhere near as perfect as people say it is anyways. I can say that this is absolutely deserving of its spot though. This is probably exactly where I would put it if I was going for a more objective list of things. It's very clear to see the influence of this album for better or for worse, but if an album has influence, that means that it's pretty much objectively good considering so many others adopted those ideas. It's definitely an important album, but it's just not one that I plan to revisit again. So overall, just as a flat rate, we're gonna say that it is deserving of its spot, but I'm going to give this a very weak 6. I'm gonna hit it with the 6- out of 10, just because that's how I feel about it. But that's all I got for you today, so drop a like on the video if you did like what you saw today, and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content coming your way. Hit the bell for notifications on that same thing as well, but that is just about gonna wrap it up for this one, and I will see you in the next video.